All right. So
Hello,
Daniel's
hello
back.
everybody. Back at the Kuti right now.
Hey,
Okay.
Daniel.
Now
Yep.
here's the funny thing. This is the Sangha UK that was set up at this time for people in UK and Europe. It's Sunday morning, but here in Thailand, it's just coming a little after 4 o'clock, and that most of the people in the group right now are in Thailand. Rick's in Bangkok. Michael is right here on the porch with us. Daniel is still in Chiang Mai. Is that right? Mm-hmm.
That's right.
And so, Freddie, you're in London. And Martin, where are you? Someplace in Europe?
France. I'm in France.
French. Yes, I can hear the French accent. Okay. So, today, let's start with the phrase, the chatter in the back of the mind. Is that the phrase that you used, Rick? All right. Now, that's actually not possible. The chatter does not come from the back of the mind, the cerebral or the anterior part. It comes, in fact, from the mid cortex, what is referred to as the mammalian brain. But a more important quality is that those thoughts jump and move very, very quickly. But in fact, I'm sure that if, let us say, 1960s and 1970s computers were part of the Buddha's vocabulary, he would use computers as an analogy. But in fact, when I first heard of this, I was in Burma, and I mulled it over and came to realize that it's an ancient teaching that's true, and that is that the mind is a serial processor. It goes from step one to step two to step three to step four, and many times those are in cycles. So you eventually come around and sometimes the cycles are very short, and sometimes the cycles are very long. But one thing for sure, and that is that we have only one event at a time going on in the mind. It's like, where do you focus your attention? For instance, you can focus your attention on your eyes. And by doing so, you're looking, which is not the same thing as thinking. But often what we do is look, think, look, think, look, think, look, think. But more often, we look, think, 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 look, think, 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 look, think, 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 think. That's the way that we normally do it, which means that we don't do a whole lot of looking, and we do a whole lot of making stuff up. And so those thoughts that you're having, another word that I've heard used is in the background. How many of you ever had the idea of the thought that you've got thoughts in the background? And when you have that thought, isn't that thought of the thoughts are in the background actually right there, center stage, right in front of you? Every thought that you ever have is right there in front. It's the only thing that we're paying attention to. But the mind, according to the Buddha, is fast. Oh, it's fast. I would say, in fact, that you probably heard of, like, the brain has waves, like alpha waves and gamma waves, and no, not gamma, but delta waves, things like that. But the alpha wave is what you could call the cycle time of the mind, that the mind cycles like a processor, like a computer, has instruction cycles that normally has a fetch, read, store cycle. That in fact, in the very oldest processors, in order to do a cycle, you had to read and then write it back, because in core memory, but long before we had real processors with real memory, we had core memory, and the core memory was a destructive read. So once you read, you had to write it back right then. So this is what we mean by cycling. And the mind is on a cycle that's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1/10 of a second. Pretty fast. Not as fast as we can measure with science, but fast enough. Okay? So whenever you look at something and you, let us say you catch something out of the corner of your eye, that's going to take a cycle. Or when you are listening to what I say and doing a Slurpee at the same time, your mind is going back and forth between putting your lips on the straw and then listening, and then starting to suck and then listening, and then having the stuff come up the tube and then listening, and then having the taste and the coolness come into the mouth and recognition of that, and then back to listening again. All right. Now, I know that Rick is smiling a lot because he understands what I'm talking about, but Daniel, he is more or less listening, but he's also darting his eyes back and forth. And so he's doing some visual stuff too. So this is, we have to understand that only one thing happens at a time. There is no such thing as background. Now, let's say that in fact that you have music playing in the background because you're actually, let's say, listening to a lecture, listening to a talk, and then the music is in the background, but it comes into the foreground when you listen to it, and then you come back, and then you listen to it again, and then you come back, and then you listen to it again, and then you come back, because the mind is cycling like this. And it moves back and forth and back and forth. And so when people say that they've got background thoughts, what that means is that they've got a certain kind of thought that keeps coming back into the foreground. And so what we actually are practicing here is to being able to control what those cycles are doing. That we're not ever trained to do that. It's funny about all the stuff that kids are trained to do in school, and the one thing that they're not ever trained in is how to think. Now, what I mean by how to think means to be able to stay on one topic and stay on it and stay on it and stay on it, as opposed to applying the mind to it and then go someplace else, come back, and then go someplace else, and then come back. And there's a lot of different places to go. One of them is in fact, you notice that I just swallowed. That took more than 1/10 of a second. And while that swallow was happening, no talking was going on. The question is, are you watching these cycles? Are you able to see that the mind is jumping from one thing to another to another? So I'll give you a fairly clear example of where the Buddha says that the mind is so fast that he doesn't even have an analogy to it. This is actually in the Anguttara Nikaya, in the ones, where there is one mind. And the mind jumps, and it jumps so fast that he has an analogy. So here's an example of that. Have you ever seen the planet Saturn with its rings? Right? You've never seen Saturn planet with its rings. You're refusing, Daniel, to see it right now, huh? And then there is the moon that goes around the planet Earth, but it doesn't have any rings. So in that regard, your mind has already just gone to Saturn, and then back to the moon, and then back to this conversation. That's how fast the mind is. It will jump. It's almost like timeless, in the sense that light is slow. They've figured it out. You know, in the old days, they thought that light was really fast, about 300,000 meters per second, or kilometers a second, or whatever. Yeah, 300,000 kilometers a second. But now they're beginning to understand that light itself is pretty slow, and that inside the mind, everything operates at the speed of light, but the cycling time of the mind is not very fast. It's about a tenth of a second. And guess what? We can, in fact, measure that, and in fact, we can change it and improve it. Here's the example of that is that have you ever seen tests called reaction times? There's some sites on the web where they have they'll give you a red screen and then we're going to change it to a green screen, and when you see it turns to green, you click the mouse. Okay, that takes about 2 mind moments. One is to see that it's changed to green, and then the second mind moment is to move the hand to click the mouse. And they rate it that ordinary average people can take as long as 350 milliseconds, and that black belt karate people can do it in 200 milliseconds, and that there are some star athletes can do it at 180 milliseconds. Well, what that means is that now their mind is cycling at 0.9, 11 cycles per second would be the way to say it. So this means then that cycle time can be changed. It also means that we're not necessarily going to have our goal as to let us say, shrink it down to where you're faster and faster at reaction times. That some people, in fact, are really, really excellent with their reaction times, and you can see that in visual sports. Like somebody can hit a baseball that's coming at him at 100 miles an hour. And so this reaction time that we have, maybe in our practice, what we want to do is to begin to stretch that time out so that the cycles become slower and slower so that we can see what's happening inside those cycles. And then, in fact, a lot of what's happening in that cycle is what we would call perception. So we look for a split second, and then we think and we mull over it, and sometimes we spend a whole lot of time just cycling through trying to figure things out. This is referred to, by the way, as the hindrance of doubt, is that, in fact, the mind will seem so slow that it seems to actually stop. And nothing's happening much for a period of time, but then it'll start back up again. But everything is in these cycles, and these cycles are not fixed in length. But in that cycle, everything is going to be happening one event after another. There's no such thing as two of them happening, two events happening in the same cycle. And yet we refer to it as that in the sense of talking about background thoughts, where in fact those are not background thoughts. They take a cycle. They're right up front. Rick, does that make sense to you now? You're muted.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. So then it's acknowledging it's at the foreground and noticing that, and then I guess moving.
Mm-hmm. So that if we begin to see that, then we can begin to control it. That one of the important qualities of the teaching of the Buddha, though it doesn't seem to be expressed with as much weight as it requires, but the teaching of the Buddha is a change, a method of change. Like, for instance, in the teaching of dukkha, dukkha, nirodha, what we mean is to be able to see that dukkha perhaps in one cycle and then change it in the next cycle. So everything is built on a change model, and the way that it's expressed is to be able to see unwholesome thoughts in one cycle and then change them in the next cycle to wholesome thoughts. until we can have one wholesome thought after another after another. Now, one of the ways that you can see these cycles easily enough is by watching other people. For instance, while you're standing or while you're online here, you can take one of the guys that's on here and begin to watch what he's doing, and you'll begin to see the cycles that each one of us are going through, except for perhaps Michael there, who is pretending to be a stone Buddha, but I see his smile. All right. So this is how we can begin to see that things change really, really fast. And that if we're not up to that change or not able to see those changes, then that means that we're behind the curve. We can't do much about it. But if we can get up on it, then we have a chance to change it. And so this is where the real practice of anapanasati comes in, is to be able to see what the mind is doing and have a preemptive strike to change it rather than chasing along after it. This is what most people are doing, is that they're trying to chase the mind rather than leading the mind. And how we do this is by playing, basically we're playing hopscotch with dukkha. We can see it in advance when it's coming, that we can see it in an early stage, that we don't have to stick with it and wallow in it and whatnot like that. We can see it immediately. You've probably seen movies to where people have grabbed spears out of the air, or maybe when they're really fast, they can grab an arrow out of the air. And then when they get all scientific and with matrices and matrix and all of that, they can grab a bullet out of the air, at least dodge the bullet. Okay. Well, this is how we want to be able to handle dodging the bullets that we shoot at ourselves, the unwholesome thoughts that keep us from being happy. And once you are able to change your mind, that is a marvelous experience. In fact, in the Sutta number 48 in the Kansambian Sutta, I mention this point often, that it is a major, major breakthrough when the student gets the idea or the opinion or applies the point that no matter how obstructed the mind gets, he can change it. He can come out of it and see reality as it is. So this is an important point about seeing reality as it is, because what we perceive is what we make up. It's not real. Nothing, all the concepts and everything that we have is something that we invent. And basically we invent by using, let us say, the equipment and the process and the goods that we use to invent is always old stuff. And what we want to start doing is to be in the senses, for instance, looking and seeing and looking and seeing and being in the sense of observation. When we're in that state, then we're in reality. And when we're thinking about reality, we're in delusion. That this is the whole point about the second noble truth, is that it's not, dukkha is not caused by greed and ill will. It's caused by our ignorance, basically our delusions about it. That in fact, when we're spot on, we can see that we want something. We say, aha, I see that I want that. And if we can catch it quick, we can say, aha, I like it, but I don't want it. Because these feelings come up really fast. They're part of the cycle. And these feelings will come up in a tenth of a second. So basically, you could say then that in the teaching of Paticca Samuppada, it would go like this, that it would take a tenth of a second to see something, then a tenth of a second to process it using perception, and then a tenth of a second to make something out of that, our concept, which is called salayatana, a tenth of a second. And then that's what impacts us not the reality, but what we made up about reality. And then the next mind moment is the feeling that arises. So we're within 5 tenths of a second or a half of a second, we can go from see to feel. From see to feel takes only about a half a second, because we have to spend that processing time. And when we get confused, what that means is we spend more and more time in processing. We try to make something up and it doesn't fit, and we make something up again and it doesn't fit, and we make something up again and it doesn't fit. And then finally, that's what we perceive is, I don't know, I don't understand. And so that way that cycling can be slowed down so that it takes a while, so that it looks like that the mind has stopped, where in fact it's cycling through perception of trying to dig something up, trying to make something up, trying to figure it out. And it looks like that the mind has stopped, but in fact it hasn't really stopped. It's just got stuck, sort of like a record that's on the same track over and over again. But you guys don't know about vinyl records. Maybe Freddie does, but the rest of you, you've got tape, and tape doesn't get stuck in a groove, but the mind does. And that we can, in fact, begin to see that happening by looking and noticing. So this is another way of having a new kind of an input, that instead of watching a truck go by or listening to music being played, we're now having the kind of mind moment of looking at what kind of thoughts are going on during that process. This is actually the reason for the Buddha's teaching, Paticca Samuppada. And in fact, you could go so far as to say that this teaching is how the mind works. Most specifically, how it gets from seeing to feeling. Because we get from seeing to feeling by manufacturing the present moment, rather than continuing to observe and continuing to observe and getting more and more input. That in fact, most people don't spend much time in input. They do a whole lot of processing, figuring it out, and then misunderstanding their concepts as reality. And so you could actually say that when someone is close to reality, when they're seeing what really is there, not just seeing with the eyes, but seeing with the ears, with the tongue, with the body, with all kinds of stuff that's going on, would be the way that I'm talking about seeing, taking input. The taking in of the input then means that we're spending our time very close to reality, seeing the way that it really is, seeing the truth, observing what's really going on. And yet we are taught to see a little bit and then process and process and process and come up with something that's delusional. And then that's what we have feelings about. So, can you make that change? Can you start watching what you make up, to recognize that almost everything that's about your life is something that you have made up? And if we can come back to reality, then we're a whole lot closer with reality as being in non-dukkha, because it's real. And so you could say that the further away we are from reality, the deeper into the dukkha we're likely to be, of not liking what's going on because we're not paying close attention. All right. Now, Freddie made the point about the word meditation. And let's talk about the word meditation for a little while. First off, everybody knows that the word meditation does not appear anywhere in the suttas. That's a word that was borrowed, and it has particular meanings to it. That in fact, in the Middle Ages, there was a lot of Catholic monks who would, let us say, try to justify the church's beliefs. And so they would have meditations like, what is the Trinity, and what is the compassion of Mother Mary, and what does it mean to have the virgin birth? You know, all of this kind of stuff. And they also had poems that would be labeled as a meditation. Basically, what we're saying then is a meditation is a cogitation, it's a confused state of mind trying to figure something out. And if it does, it comes up with a concept. This is why I want to make sure that you guys understand that we can use the meditation, the word meditation, lightly, but we have to really understand that the original use of the word meditation and what most people think is not what we're actually practicing. That we're actually practicing a change model. Can you see that stuff and then catch it before it gets into being conceptualized? Can you see the things the way that they are? And also, you can begin to talk yourself into a better state of mind. That this is where in step 10, it's actually not a step because these things don't happen in a stepwise fashion like a march. It's much more like a waltz. So that we're all over the place, and you don't take from step 1 to step 2 to step 3 to step 4. Sometimes you go from 1 to 4 to 3 to 2 to 5 to 4 to 3, back and forth like this. This is what we actually mean, because the mind is really fast. But we do want to spend some mind moments gladdening the mind. This is step 10 of Anapanasati. The gladdening of the mind actually does not necessarily just mean to have happy thoughts, but we use happy thoughts to actually change the mind state. This is an important point. We're actually changing the state of mind that we're in. And we use happy words to change that state of mind from being a victim to where nothing is right into the winner because we've just said everything right. Yeah, this is good enough. This is the basic practice of getting everything back to reality. And reality is pretty good. I mean, you're all still alive. Hasn't one person here on this call died while we were talking? You're all still alive. Congratulations. Everything is okay. Even though we have negative thoughts, those negative thoughts haven't killed you. Brighten up already. This is the whole quality that we're actually looking for, is to be able to say, everything is all right. Let's not get the mind bent over and bent out of shape with our perceptions and all of our old ways of looking at things. Let's look at things in a new way. And the new way is the real way. So we keep needing to look at things the way that they actually are. And the way that they actually are is this moment is just fine. I can't think of a thing, I can't find a thing that's wrong with this present moment. Daniel, is this present moment okay for you?
Hunky dory.
Hunky dory, yes. I know Dory, and she is hunky. Everything is hunky-dory. Everything is okay. That's the kind of gladdening of the mind that we need to do, is to keep coming back over and over and over again and changing the mind out of the mind state that it's normally in. And the normal state of mind that we're in is in a state of dukkha, a state of disappointment, a state of being a victim, a state of this is not good enough. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about. You spend a lot of time in that state. And if you can remember,
Dhammarato?
yes, go ahead, Martin.
Previously you also said that we want to stay more in the senses, but sometime when I'm watching my thought, to have wholesome thought, I have the feeling that I am more in my thought than in my senses. Does it, So how do we, maybe balance the two, to be in the senses, but also to watch the thought?
Yes, that in fact, being in the senses, as we're in the senses, we will get distracted by the next mind moment that's in thought. Can you watch that transition? Do you know when you're actually feeling or experiencing something? When I say feeling, I'm talking about sensory input feeling, like sensation, because the body is constantly having sensation. In fact, we are flooded with sensation. We can feel the air, we can feel the breeze, we can feel the contact. You can feel actually as your bottom is sitting on the chair, look how much of the bottom actually is sending back feedback. From the back of the knees all around the buttocks, there's 10,000 nerves just screaming about how this chair feels. And we're not paying any attention to that. That we have information coming in about our posture. We have information coming in about our breathing. We have all kinds of sensory input that we don't generally pay much attention to because we're too busy thinking about how bad things are, rather than finding ways of letting the body be comfortable, be easy. But this is where we start to put our focus, basically then, and I'll use the word focus because, as you know, I'm pretty adamantly, in fact, quite hateful against the word, can't even think of it, concentration.
Concentration.
Yes, because we are not practicing concentration. We're, in fact, practicing being awake, being aware. Here's a good example. A kid is working on his computer at home, and let us say that he's a teenager writing code. Maybe he's trying to figure out how to hack his daddy's company's computers or something. And dad comes down the hall and opens the door and says good night to his son. And his son is so concentrating on what he's doing that he doesn't pay attention to dad. Maybe he'll give it one mind moment and then back to the code. And then dad gets unhappy and upset because the boy's not even saying good night. Now let's take a trip backwards about 10 years to where the kid is only 6 or 7 years old. He's got a computer and he was told to go to bed. And now he's up past his bedtime and he's playing a game on that computer, and dad walks down the hall. That kid can hear him. He can hear the footsteps of his dad, and he can turn that computer's monitor off and jump into bed before dad opens the door to say goodnight. Right? That young child had better, let us say, sensory input because he was not concentrating. So whenever you're doing something like repetitive work, writing code or anything like that, what we really need to do is on a regular basis come back to reality, to take a deep breath, come back to the fact that here we are, open our eyes, be here now, and then go back into whatever we were concentrating on. Now, we can actually then learn to focus on that rather than focusing on the code. We can focus on being here now. Let's start having more and more sensory input and less windmills spinning in the mind. This will lead to your happiness and joy for a long time. This is the promise of Anapanasati. It's of great benefit to come into the present moment, that you gladden the mind, you brighten it up and says, hey, everything is all right. Look at it. Look how nice things are. So, here's a point. If the thought comes, oh, we've got that call at 4 o'clock, and oh, I don't think that I really want to do it, okay? And then I catch that thought, and I say, hey, we've got 10 minutes. Let me lay here and enjoy myself, and I'll be up and ready for that call. Those are the kind of thoughts But if I have the thought, oh, poor me, I don't want to do that call, then I won't be ready for it. And you can see that also. Oh, I've got to go to class now. Oh, poor me, I don't want to go. Or, oh, I've got to go get on the bus right now. And, oh, I don't want to do that. Oh, poor me. These are the kind of thoughts that we have in a normal living. Can
I
you
have this
see
in the
those
morning
thoughts? Pardon?
when I'm laying in bed and my alarm goes off. Then I always lay in bed for like 5 or 10 minutes with the thought like, oh, I'm not awake enough. I'm not ready to get out of bed. So
All right.
what I
This is,
started to
by
do
the
was,
way, why they have snooze alarms. In the old days, the alarm clock went off and it just went off and that was it. People would go back to sleep or go back and lay down, and then the snooze alarm doesn't go off and they miss work. So thank heaven for little snooze alarms. Every cell phone's got one. But here's the point, is that you can say, all right, between now and the next time that snooze alarm goes off, I'm going to lay here and really enjoy the day. But this is really marvelous. I can lay here and I don't have to get up yet, and everything is fine. And when I do get up, I'll be ready to get up. And I'm not even going to get up until I'm ready to get up. And guess what? I'm already ready. So we can actually practice Anapanasati when we're in bed in the morning. I highly recommend it because most of us, we don't want to get up. We don't want to go face the day. I mean, I got so much work to do and people are wanting so much from me. And oh, poor me, you know the kind of thoughts that I'm talking about. Everybody has those thoughts. Can you see them and say, hot dog, I can change that? I can change the way that the mind works. That's the whole practice of Anapanasati, is to start looking at what kind of thoughts we have. And so when we go to bed at night, same thing. Oh, I've got so much work to do. Oh, I'm so tired. Oh, poor me. Let me go to sleep. And then we're not going to sleep. The mind is spinning and spinning and spinning. But in fact, I've heard something that's quite interesting, and that is that the easiest way to go to sleep is by pretending that you're going to sleep. Now, they're actually missing a little point there, and that is that it's not really pretending, that you actually can watch yourself going to sleep rather than just having the mind spin with all the stuff that's going to happen the next day. So we can actually enjoy watching the body go to sleep. Oh, everything is so nice. Oh, I don't have to go anywhere for the next 8 hours. I can just lay here. Ah, everything is good. And that's how we can go to sleep, easy enough. Practicing Anapanasati when we wake up, practice Anapanasati when we're going to sleep. Another time to practice is when we're eating food, because most of us, when we're actually eating and chewing, we're thinking about something else. We're watching a movie while we're chewing. And I say the while we're chewing is that the movie is playing and we're paying attention to the movie as opposed to paying attention to each bite. This is part of the practice that the monks have, and that there is actually a sutta, number 2, in the Majjhima Nikaya, where it talks about mindfully, I'll eat this food. I'll watch what I'm doing. The monks practice withdrawing their hands from the bowl while they're chewing, because most of us from childhood play with our food. Imagine the guy's eating a steak, and there he is, and he's cut with his knife and his fork, and he's put a piece of steak in his mouth. What is he doing now? He's cutting the next piece while he's chewing. He's not even paying attention to that bite that he's got in his mouth. Can we actually start watching what we're eating? Mull it around. Find out which is the best tooth if you've got only a few left. And chew it that way. Pay attention. And then the Buddha talks about it in the sense that we don't take the next bite until all of the stuff that was in the mouth has been swallowed, down to not even a grain of rice. So the last thing that we would do is we would look with our tongue all up and down and around. Is there any food left at all in here? No. Now we can put the hand back in the bowl and get the next bite. That's an excellent training. And if you can train to do that with your food, you can train to do that with everything. We can begin to savor every morsel of life because we're paying attention to what we're doing rather than thinking our way through it. So this is why we don't call this practice meditation, and we don't even have to do it in a formalized way, going to a particular meditation hall, sitting on a particular cushion at a particular time of day with a particular bunch of people. That's all conceptualized. The Buddha doesn't say that at all. He says to get away from other people, to go to the woods, go to a tree, go to an empty hut. Get away from as much sensory input as you can so that you can start to pay attention to the sensory input that is there, rather than having it scattered and busy and all over the place. And so we want to make things as simple as we can so that we can begin to focus on that which is worthy of being focused on, which is reality. So, Rick, do you have anything to say about this?
Oh yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Although I still have to, I guess it kind of feels like, oh, you're saying that, and I'm gonna go to Dipapavan, which is a place with a lot of people and stuff.
So when you go to Dipapavan, go there as if you're the only one there. That takes a bit of pretense, but they want you to practice that pretense. They call it noble silence. Don't pay attention to all of those other people in the sense of look at them as individuals, but look at it actually as an ocean or a stream or just the surrounding reality that's constantly in motion, constantly shifting.
Well, I do have a question. Like, what's the difference between having a sensory input of a bit bustling city versus the sensory input of nature? Because if you just see it as it is, it's all kind of the same, right?
Well, I'll tell you what. When there is too much sensory input, then it all becomes noise. The example that I would use, and I think that Freddie would know quite a lot about this, is there's a difference when an orchestra is tuning up. Have you ever been to a live concert where they're tuning up? When they are tuning up, they're all playing the same note. But almost every musician also not just tunes up, but they warm up. And they'll play their favorite little passage. They may play a scale. They may play some chords. They may do something. But then it's noisy. You cannot even tell what all is happening because there's too much happening. This is like being in a city. But then the conductor will come up and he'll bang his baton on the podium or whatever, and now it gets quiet again. All right? This is the way that we would want to live, as if we can focus on what's really important in that city. That takes a lot of discernment, a lot of skill. This is why the Buddha would recommend start with quiet. Start with nothing happening. Start with the amount that you can, you've heard the idea of biting off more than you can chew. Well, a city is more than people can chew. especially when they're unskilled at it. And it's just noisy and dangerous, and people are confused and all of that kind of stuff. That in fact, Rick, you're in Bangkok now and you're not used to the city. And you can tell that the vibe is a vibe of, wow, too much is happening. There's too many people. There's too much going on, right? This is why we want to go and practice in quietude, in silence, so that we can manage the amount of sensory input. And yet, even when you go to the forest and you think that things are quiet and easy going, oh no, there's a billion things happening every 10th of a second right there in the forest also. But it's much more in harmony with itself. It's not so much noisy. It's sort of like a symphony orchestra actually now playing the music, because that's what you'll find in the woods or in the forest, in the environment that you're in. That you'll hear the birds singing and you'll feel the breeze. There's a huge amount of stuff happening, but it's not the rumble that you find in a city. But in fact, I have pointed that out to students who have moved out of New York into a city or a place where it's not like New York. And I tell him to reflect upon it. That there was just so much going on in that city that you couldn't even keep track of it all. And so it winds up being just a bunch of noise. And what we can do instead is get ourselves into a place where it's much more in harmony with itself, so that we can find, let us say, some peace and quiet, some solitude. And this is where we want to practice and go back to that state of solitude often, because that's the best place to practice. When there's too much going on, it's hard to keep track of anything. And so we can limit the amount of input that we deal with. And this is what I would recommend, that in the city, the best thing to do is to go to that hut that you paid 500 baht for and go into your room and enjoy the quiet, knowing that it's not nearly as quiet in that room because there's a lot of noise, road noise. And in fact, road noise is a major issue. The city is constantly rumbling. It's rumbling at a low frequency. And we can pay attention to that when we go to the city, so that we can appreciate when we're not in the city that things are not rumbling, they're not noisy, it's quiet. That in fact the same thing is true even of electricity. That when you've got electricity in your house, there's a certain kind of rumbling that's going on. And when you turn that power off, or you have a power failure, immediately things begin to lighten up. It's not so oppressive. And so this is what I would recommend is to experience the distinction. And it's hard for people to understand this, because when you go into a city, you go into it slowly and things kind of build up and they're kind of up and down. But really it's very, very high, not high in the sense of the frequency, but in the sense of the volume. It's a high volume roar. And it's part of that input. Sort of like the way that we eat food. That we're not paying attention to the eating of the food because there's all this other stuff that we could pay attention to instead. Like, for instance, playing with our food, or ordering more from the waiter, or looking out the window, or watching television. And very rarely are we, when we're eating, actually just eating, because that's what we're paying attention to. And so this is what Anapanasati is all about, is learning how to pay attention to that which is worthy of paying attention to. This is an important point, that in fact there's a sutta, number 2, that I just mentioned about the eating practice, is that it's talking about what is worthy of our attention. What are we paying attention to? And what the Buddha recommends is that you pay attention more and more to the Four Noble Truths. You pay attention to, this is dukkha. You pay attention to, this is the cause of dukkha. You pay then great amount of attention to, this is what it's like to be free from dukkha. And then we can pay attention to, oh, these are the little steps that we go through to get into that state, which is to see what's going on and to make a change. To remember to look at what's going on, sati, to then look at what's going on, and then making a change to settle down. This is what is worthy of our attention. To see when we're giving ourselves unwholesome thoughts, and then change that into more wholesome, happy, settled, easygoing thoughts. This is the teaching of Anapanasati. This is the teaching of the Eightfold Noble Path. This is the teaching of the entire teaching of the Buddha. Dukkha, dukkha, nirodha. Can you see that dukkha and come out of it? Michael, do you have anything to say about this?
Could you talk a little bit more about slowing the cycles down and how that process works in the mind?
Okay. Michael, he says that the lights are on your motorbike.
What?
Yeah. Our downstairs neighbor just said that your bike has got the lights on. But anyway, we'll be finished in a minute. They've been on for 2 hours now or more. So another 3 or 4 minutes is not going to hurt. Yes, the slowing of the cycles down has to do with being aware of these cycles. That will slow them down. Is to start watching the cycles, recognizing that things are that way, intentionally making the change to slow things down. Easy enough to do if you pay attention to it. Just let it be easy. To stop being in a rush. So, Freddie, do you have anything to say?
I was thinking just then about the second step, or the second Four Noble Truth, like recognizing the cause. I mean, how important is that? I mean, I think you're putting more emphasis on like changing. But
actually, no, the cause of suffering primarily is not the greed and ill will, is our ignorance of it, that we don't know.
But how important is it to like to kind of identify the cause? Like, how important is that? You know, let's say you see suffering. I mean, is it important to go to figure out the root, investigate it?
All right. This is basically what we can say is that there are several keys or key words that the Buddha uses to point to this. One of the words that he uses is the word hindrance or obstruction. Now, the hindrance or obstruction means that something is preventing you from being in the state that you want to be in, which is basically a state of rest, a state of harmony. The next word that is used is unwholesome thoughts. The thoughts that are unwholesome are actually dukkha. The thoughts that are unwholesome are those thoughts that keep you from being at a state of rest. And those are the thoughts that we have to identify. Because in fact, if we are not in a state of rest, then some bright object will happen, and then we'll go into wanting it. So when you like something, do you notice that you just like it and let that be, rather than liking it and then wanting it? That can be as simple as seeing a cup of coffee on your table and seeing it, now we want it, as opposed to just seeing it there and letting it be. And then if we're thirsty, now we'll drink because we're thirsty, not because we saw the cup. So, can we put that in practice in the sense of recognizing that all of this input that we'll have from a city means that there's all kinds of things to want, or all kinds of things to want to get rid of. And if we can simplify that, now we can pay better attention to what we want and what we don't want so that we're not so ignorant of it. So this is what we mean then about unwholesome thoughts or about dukkha or about the hindrances is that we will come slightly attached to something, we'll want it, we'll want to change it, rather than recognizing that all the change that needs to be made is inside the mind, to come out of wanting to change it into everything's okay, yeah, it's there, so what, no problem. And so we come out of our looking and then deciding and perceiving and then making up something and then getting attached to it. What we do instead is we continue to take sensory input rather than perceiving or making stuff up about it, making up a story, and just letting it be.
I have a question that fits in nicely with Freddie's question. And that is, maybe you mean this as well, Freddie, is that when I'm doing Anapanasati, sometimes I will notice there is some dukkha. And I have noticed that when I take a bit more time to investigate, then sometimes it's more effective when I do the gladdening of the mind afterwards. So when I just know there is some dukkha and I just right away start changing to wholesome thoughts, but I haven't really looked at what is going on, then I feel like it's less
That's right.
effective.
Right. There's no reason to just automatically jump into change. We actually need to do the investigation enough to figure out what is it that needs to be changed,
Yeah,
which
I was
will
really
often
stuck on
take
this.
more sensory input. Let's investigate. Let's really check that out, and then we can make the change. You could actually say that, in fact, of tuning a musical instrument. You play the note and then you listen and you check to see, is that on key yet or not? And then you adjust it. A beginner, in fact, will adjust it in the wrong direction. He wants to make it a tiny little bit sharper and he makes it flatter instead because he's in a rush. He's not really listening to the tones. Okay, so you can take that as the example of what you mean. And yes, I agree with you 100%, Daniel. We really do need to do more than one or two investigations. We need to investigate, investigate, investigate so that we can make just the right change.
I noticed that when I'm being in a state of like, oh, I cannot have any dukkha, then I want to change it instantly. So I kind of rush into having wholesome thoughts instead of really taking the time. So now that I'm really slowing it down, yeah, it has really changed my practice.
Mm-hmm. That, in fact, in a way, I'm using the word slow it down as a metaphor for spending more time in sensory input rather than in perception, is to keep coming back and looking, keep seeing what's really there, keep rechecking it and rechecking it so that when we make a change, it's spot on. But most people, they're not doing that. They're not really looking. They're trying to make stuff up. That's what a meditation really is actually making more and more stuff up rather than recognizing what's really truly there. There's no end to the number of gods that you can make up. Humanity has been making up gods and trying to make them real for centuries. But the reality is that all we have is reality. Let that be your God. Whatever is real, that's it. Rather than making stuff up. That way, when we're creative, we know what we're doing. That in fact, using reality as a way of making an invention. You know, they say that an invention or genius or whatever is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. I'm not really sure that that's correct, but what they're pointing at is that we have to keep looking before we're tweaking. We have to investigate. And then when we're tweaking things, we can tweak it in just the right direction. So I can imagine that Edison and his group, when they were trying to invent the light bulb, an incandescent light, they were just willy-nilly trying all kinds of things rather than actually investigating what would work, to doing the scientific investigation. That they tried carbon filaments and they tried copper and they tried all kinds of things, not getting the results. But if they'd have sat down and begin to understand why things weren't working, instead of trying over and over again, they could hit on it and say, yeah, well, I know. That in fact, this is actually quite famous, that scientists will work all day long experimenting, playing, and trying to force it because they really want it to be right. And then they'll go to bed, and as they're waking up in the morning, the solution will come to them. Oh, this is what I need. I stopped trying to fix it long enough to actually investigate it, and then the right thing to do comes immediately. So this is a way of talking about slowing it down, where we get in a hurry to fix it rather than making sure about what we're doing, to keep looking, keep investigating, keep noticing. Freddie, does that work for you? You understand what I'm saying? Great.
Yeah.
How about
It's
you, Rick?
It's an
Go
equal
ahead.
part. Sorry, I was going to say it's like an equal part as the flip around is the the investigation, you know.
Mm-hmm. Which the investigation then is being real, staying in reality rather than making stuff up and making stuff up. That's what perception is the process of, in fact, the Pali word, there's two different words for it. One is Namarupa and the other one is Sanya. But you can look at that word Namarupa and basically what it means is you're taking Rupa, the reality, the real, and trying to name it, trying to grasp hold of it, trying to see what it is. And we often do that too soon. So we grab it. It's like grabbing the snake by the wrong end. Now, real professionals can grab a snake any way that they want to because they're watching very closely. But the right way to grab a snake is right behind the head, up into the throat, so that it can't bite. So we have to be able to tell the difference about which end of the snake we're grabbing. Don't grab the snake by the tail just because you saw it first. No, you got to do some more investigation to figure out where the head of that snake is so you'll know how to grab it. So does anybody else have anything to say?
I did have one question, and that is that I noticed that when I'm following the breath, I am automatically doing the chasing of the breathing. So I'm going like from my nose down to my midriff and then back.
Mm-hmm.
But
That's quite natural. that we do kind of start at the beginning at the nose, and then we'll get down into the at the end of the full breath, our belly rises, and we notice that too. And then when we breathe out, the belly starts to fall, and then we'll chase it back out. This is known for a long time as part of Anapanasati, is what they call either chasing or following the breath.
Is it important to train yourself to notice it like in that sequence? Because sometimes I feel like maybe I'm forcing
No.
it a bit too much and I should just pay attention to wherever I feel it.
Yes, that's the whole point. Is that chasing and following has too much structure to it, and the reality is the Sutta number 111, when we learn one by one as they occur. That in fact, when I say one by one as they occur, takes us all the way back to the beginning of our talk about the mind being in a cycle, and one thing at a time and one thing at a time. So whatever is coming up, that's what we're going to be paying attention to, one by one as they occur. So sometimes you can go right from the nose into the belly. And sometimes while you're breathing out, you'll go from the belly to the nose and then back to the belly. That's okay, so long as you're paying attention to what the body is doing, as opposed to thinking that you're breathing and watching the breath, where in fact you're thinking about Aunt Susie. Because thoughts are mixed with Aunt Susie and the breathing. Can we in fact see that we're back and forth in that chatter and come back and just pay attention to the breathing?
Is it possible? I have a question. Is it possible to get too interested in the investigation and then get a bit lost? Like, let's say I
Yes,
start thinking
but let's
about
not get lost. Let's come back to the investigation rather than the concept of investigation, because that's what you're talking about, is that we get from the real investigation of actually looking into thinking about investigation. And yeah, it's okay to do a little of that, but catch it and then come back into the reality of the investigation rather than thinking about investigation. That in fact, that's part of the problem with language and having these talks here, is that we're doing it all in conceptualization. That it's difficult for me to teach directly. And that's one of the values that I got from Achan Po, was that he found ways, even though he didn't speak English, language was not so much of a problem. He found direct ways to teach. So your job here is to hear the conceptualizations that I'm using when we're speaking in language, and then take that out of the conceptualization into the reality. The actual reality of what does the shirt that you're wearing feel like? What does it feel like when your feet are touching the floor, or are they cross-legged or whatever like that? To be aware of your posture. That's reality. But thinking about what posture you want to be in, that's conceptualization again. That's Dhammarato. That's perception.
So is investigation just your senses, or is that thinking?
Paying attention to what's going on real.
Because sometimes I think I've been just going, like, using my brain to investigate too much. Like, I get lost and then I use my brain to go back in time, using my memory to why I got distracted. I mean, but is that, I don't know if that's right, or I don't know if I should.
It has no value, because that keeps you in the conceptualization, especially in the past. So the easier thing to do, in fact, the superior thing to do, is say, never mind about that. Let me have take a deep breath and enjoy it in this moment.
But
rather than trying to figure out how I got someplace. That this is very much like whether we're talking about it as old age psychological archaeology or momentary. I mean, We can go back 3, 4, 5, 10 seconds and gain some value. But going about 5, 10, 15, or 20 years has very little value. And yet we spend a lot of time reminiscing about the past. Let's
I'm
be
talking
here
more about
in this moment.
10 seconds. The 10 seconds period. I'm more talking about like just yeah, just that's that period of like because
And you recognize that when it's occurring. Now you remember doing it, but when you're actually doing it, can you recognize, oh, I'm in the past. It's only 10 seconds, but I'm still in the past. And this is
yeah, but I feel like
yes, let me take a deep breath. The breath is really a valuable anchor to bring you back right now into the present moment.
But I feel like I'm doing it because I'm trying to investigate the source of the dukkha. That's why I'm doing.
You don't need to see the source of the dukkha. Actually, we've already established what the source of the dukkha is that you weren't paying attention. And so now while you're trying to figure out the source of the dukkha, you're again not paying attention.
Okay.
You're conceptualizing your way into it.
Yeah. Okay,
Brother,
I see.
Thank you for this question. That's an important point.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you answered that because I've been doing that. I've been sitting and then like I get distracted about something and then I'm like, well, I need to figure out why I got distracted, and then I go like,
no, that's just more distractions. Instead, you can say, I dropped that. Wow, I'm glad I'm free from that. I don't have to figure it all out. I can be happy without knowing.
Yeah.
That
It's a
was
bit like
one of the
I was
teachings.
kind of like trying to do some kind of psychoanalysis.
Yes, let's stop structurally analyzing stuff and just enjoy it instead.
Yeah.
That in fact, in a way, we can say, let's just stop being an engineer and start being an artist. So the engineer will take a look at that building and he'll think about how it's structured and how much steel is in it and why it doesn't fall over because of the foundation. He can find all kinds of things wrong with that building. To where the artist is looking at that building, wow, that's nice. It looks like it's going to fall over, but it doesn't. Isn't that marvelous? That's the idea, is to come out of being the engineer and become the artist, to appreciate the way things are without having to figure out how they got that way. All right, guys. Well, why don't we end the call now? Everybody happy and satisfied that we're in the present moment. We're enjoying the way reality actually appears to us rather than trying to figure out how it got here. Let's be the artist. Let's stop being the engineer.
Thank you so much, Dhammarato. Thank you guys for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you, Dhammarato. Good to see everybody.
Yes, it's good to see everybody. Thank you for coming.
See you later.
All right, see ya. Bye-bye.